Grand Blue is undoubtedly the best work of all time, which got me wondering, out of the 100 plus chapters, which are the best of the best? In today's video, I'll be ranking my pick for the top 10 chapters in Grand Blue Dreaming, along with giving you a recap of what happened in each, and reasoning as to why they're in the spots that they are. And obviously this will contain heavy spoilers, so be advised. Though I should say, this is going to be my personal favorite chapters in terms of the narrative impacts it had on me while reading them. And next week, I'll be posting my top 10 funniest chapters, so pure comedy ones will be regulated to that video. With that being said, when picking out the top 10, there were a bunch of chapters to choose from, but not all of them made the cut, so I want to highlight a couple honorable mentions before we get into the rankings. As my first honorable mention goes to Chapter 1, Deep Blue. Specifically, this scene.
最初から自分ができるものだけ選んでいたら何も始まらない。大事なのはお前が興味を抱いているかどうかだろ。
I know, it's basic to pick the first chapter, but that scene was the very first foray into the more serious / hardy side of Grand Blue. As without it, Iori would have never given diving a chance, and in turn the rest of the story would have unfolded very differently. From here on out, you'll notice a trend that my top 10 picks are all concerned with the rare wholesome side of Grand Blue, specifically concerned with character arcs where they grow and mature. Though that can't be said about my next and last honorable mention, which is Chapter 69. To Returning. There's nothing super deep about this one, I just really like Sakurako. With that out of the way, my number 10 pick is gonna have to be Chapter 30, titled I'm Not Stripping, okay? Since this one's animated, I'll just use the footage for it and subsequent ones that are as well. In Chapter 30, or Episode 3 of Season 2, the main conflict is that Iori must find a way to overcome the awkwardness after Nanaka overheard him mentioning how he views her. What earns this chapter its spot on my list comes after the halfway point, when Azusa arrives at Grand Blue to save Iori. In a classic Peekaboo Senpai scene, Azusa was able to effectively repair Nanaka and Iori's relationship by getting Iori to confess how he really feels about his cousin. The cherry on top of this absolute dessert of a chapter is this line from Iori, when he goes to drink with the 4 Peekaboo Senpais.
あの4人もいろいろあって今の関係に落ち着いたってことか。
This shot says so much about the work as a whole, as it's not only the lesson that Iori learns from the chapter, but also parallels the 4 senpais with the 4 first years as well. I just absolutely love how there's the implication here that before the events of the story, Nanaka, Tokita, Kotobuki, and Azusa all had their own adventures, where they were the Kohais in Peekaboo, that possibly even mirrored those that Iori, Kohei, Chisa, and Aina are experiencing throughout the course of the story proper. This shot continues to age extremely well into the later parts of the manga, as every new chapter is another adventure in memory for the first years. And for that, Chapter 30 earns its 10th spot onto my list. Chapter 8, titled Mr. Izu, holds the 9th place spot. As the chapter title implies, the main event is the Izu Spring Festival, specifically the male beauty pageant during it. Though, the 2 scenes that sold me were when Iori and Kohei gained the resolve to stand up for Aina after she was effectively bullied out of Tinkerbell, along with the actual scene of them executing their plan. You see, this is the first time we actually get to see what kind of main character Iori is, and by extension Kohei as well. While on the surface, it could appear that they simply avenged Aina here, but it's so much deeper than that, as it sets up and establishes some of the core values that both Iori and Kohei stand for, which I'll be elaborating more the higher we get into the list. But for these scenes, Chapter 8 is my pick for the 9th best chapter in Grand Blue. The number 8 spot goes to Chapter 58, titled The End of Summer Vacation. It also marks a point of the list where some of the chapters go past where the anime adapts, so anime-only viewers, this is your final spoiler warning. Anyway, the main plotline that I want to discuss occurs after the halfway point of the chapter, when Iori, Kohei, and Aina help Tokita and Azusa prep for job interviews. On the surface, this sounds extremely simple, but given the context of the past 58 chapters, it's always usually been the third years looking after and helping the first years. But this was the first time where the freshmen turn the tables and take up a position to help out their beloved senpais. I'm mentioning this a bit late, but Yoshioka Kimitake's art is nothing short of amazing, as the facial expressions in the manga perfectly capture the character's emotions and thoughts whenever he puts pen to paper, along with exactly how we're meant to perceive them each time. While this chapter is generally more comedic in tone than the previous picks, the growth made by the first years in this one really show how much they've come since the beginning of the manga. Though, if this chapter felt familiar, it's because the broad strokes of the themes parallel those of chapter 46. Though, the reason why I picked chapter 58 over 46 is because the party thrown in that one felt more so out of obligation to me, referring back to the scene where Kudo broke the news to Iori and Kohei of the senpai's retirement. environment. Though that's not to say that it's intrinsically worse because of said obligation, it's just I like how the first years actively took the initiative in chapter 58 to help the senpais as opposed to only throwing a party like in 46, which admittedly still was a good chapter as well. And for that, chapter 58 cements its number 8 ranking. The number 7 spot goes to chapter 94, titled Answer. The chapter acts as a continuation of and the emotional finale to the Izu Fall Festival arc, and also is the perfect conclusion to Aina's main character arc regarding her unrequited feelings for Iori that had been lingering near the start of the manga. To run through it really quickly, during the Mist Con of the Fall Festival, in a twist of fate, the two finalists end up being Chisa and Aina, whose final score is dependent on Iori, who has been made a judge for the event. And ultimately his score shockingly leads to Aina's victory over Chisa. Later at a peekaboo party, we have a pretty emotional confession scene from Aina as she pours her heart out to Iori. This results in an off-screen rejection, and depicting it this way makes it feel so much more emotional somehow. And the chapter ends with Kohei asking out Aina, properly putting a bow onto her finished character arc that started in chapter 8. You see, when this chapter dropped, it rocked the Grand Blue community to its core because of the huge reveal at the end, as less astute readers were confused as to why Kohei seemingly asked Aina out of nowhere. But if you've been picking up on a lot of the really subtle details and facial expressions from him throughout the preceding chapters, you'd know that this was naturally built up to and hinted at for years. And the fact that Kohei is now the one asking out Aina in the bushes is a really poetic bookend to the way that she did it during the Izu Spring Festival, down to the exact location. That payoff felt extremely satisfying not only for Kohei's growth, but also for Aina's arc, as not only did she go all out in this chapter and even beat Chisa, but she was able to move on from her rejection almost instantly thanks to Kohei. And due to this 10-year payoff, chapter 94 earns its spot as my number 7 pick. And as for my personal thoughts, I think they suit each other much more than the Aina-Iori pairing, and low-key always knew that chapter 7 scene wasn't just a loose thread. My number 6 pick is going to be another Aina-focused one in chapter 17, beautifully titled A Place Without Lies. At this point, it should be pretty obvious that I love the main 8 leads of Grand Blue, and that I really love the senpais of the club. As in this chapter, the main conflict is that Aina feels haunted with her past experiences with Tinkerbell, leading her to feel somewhat isolated from Peekaboo. And this swells during the first year's license training, when she ends up using more air than Iori and Kohei, in which she contemplates lying about in order to not feel like dead weight to the rest of Peekaboo. This is until Iori seemingly notices Aina's plan, and results in her ultimately telling the truth, leading to the club's ascent, effectively ending the dive. On land, Iori confronts Aina about what she was about to do, and Iori, of course being the goated main character that he is, handles this in the best way possible, by taking her to the senpais, where Zusa once again lays down some of the best lines of dialogue from the manga. I don't feel the need to explain or analyze this one because it speaks for itself. Though, just keep this line in the back of your head for now, as this would go on to be the absolute essence of what kind of main character Iori is and who he is as a person, which I'll be explaining later. Though this scene and chapter as a whole was when I knew that Grand Blue was something truly special, as up until that point, comedy has been its bread and butter. And don't worry, it still is, but this was a chapter that proved that Inoue Kenji is really the author that's able to weave in scenes with tons of emotional weight, while balancing it with some of the most absurd comedy possible. Number 57, simply titled Mom, is my number 5 pick for the top 10 best chapters list, as it's another arc's emotional conclusion, and that is the Palau arc, where there's an underlying conflict revolving around Chisa's strained relationship with her distant mother, and really something that Chisa's been struggling with since the earlier chapters. Essentially, she feels that she's constantly falling short of her mother's expectations, and this has been haunting her self-confidence and capabilities, as someone on track to becoming a diving instructor, much like Nanaka. The climax of this arc comes when Iori, in an act of self-sacrifice, decides to miss the plane ride back to Izu, in order to stay in Palau to essentially confront Sayaka about her distancing of her youngest daughter, which results in Chisa finally understanding her mother thanks to Iori. I don't have much to say on this, it's just an absolutely beautifully emotional chapter with an extraordinary conclusion that draws the curtains onto the summer saga of Grand Blue, along with some much needed heavy lifting for Chisa's characterization, which once again also demonstrates Iori's selflessness, as did some of my prior picks, which also happens to be his other core character definition. My number 4 pick will be rooted in an extremely biased take, but I kinda don't care. Chapter 89 is titled Sakurako Busujima, and immediately already sets the tone of what the chapter will be like. In it is the conclusion to Sakurako's character arc, similar to that of Aina's in chapter 94. However, this time, the chapter solely focuses on her and Iori's relationship. I'll be saving most of the discussion about this chapter for my character analysis video on Sakurako proper. However, this was her final attempt to win Iori over, in which we finally learned that her feelings for him were in fact genuine, as there's always been an air of doubt regarding them up until this point. And likewise, it's pretty clear Iori does indeed care about her as well, to an extent at least. Namely the part when he makes her food while she's, sick. See, this part speaks volumes to me personally, as when I was still in cooking school, there was something one of my chefs would always reiterate, and that was, cooking a meal for someone is one of the kindest things you could do for them, as everyone needs to eat, and something like this coming from Iori for Sakurako is pretty special, given the circumstances of their relationship. Tangent aside, once again, the underlying theme of Iori's tolerance and acceptance is highlighted by her during this finale, which is why she fell for him in the first place. I know I'm not mentioning much about the plot of it right now, but this was easily the most emotionally heavy chapter in this manga for me. The gut-wrenching feeling of bittersweetness from it is something that's truly hard to describe, as on the bitter side, it felt absolutely devastating that Sakurako's time in the Grand Blue limelight was reaching its conclusion. But on the sweet side, I think this chapter was written masterfully, as the way Sakurako actually gets rejected was handled perfectly, albeit not the outcome I was hoping for, but that's just a testament of Inoue Kenji's writing. I didn't want this chapter to happen, but it ended up being one of my favorites, regardless of outcome. It's not something I can explain really easily, but just know that it's my number 4 pick. Mainly because Sakurako's my favorite character in fiction, and her character arc's finale is obviously gonna break into the top 4. Alright, we're finally into the top 3, and honestly, these chapters could all be in the number 1 spot for me, depending on how I'm feeling. But currently, my number 3 has to be chapter 76. Wedding Reception. This is the Kohei chapter, which unfortunately means most of it will be covered in his own character analysis video later on, but I do want to talk about the chapter a little bit right now though. As the main conflict in this one is Kohei coming to terms with Mizuki Kaya's wedding, someone whom he's been idolizing immensely since we first met Kohei back in 2014, and really an influential figure in shaping who he's become as the person we know today. The scene I want to talk about is here, which I'll let the panels speak for themselves. This was, in a way, kind of a conclusion to a character arc of Kohei that really wasn't focused on throughout most of the story, as it took a ton of maturity from him to say this line. Without getting too much into it, I relate to Kohei immensely here. Specifically this line. I'm dead serious, this may be the deepest line in the whole manga. At least for me, and how I personally relate to it. And seeing his growth blossom into this scene was honestly, without any exaggeration, life-changing for me. As I know exactly how he felt in this chapter, which once again is attributed to how much of a master of the pen Inoue Kenji is. Being able to capture a real-life feeling that I've personally felt via pen and paper. No notes, chef's kiss, masterpiece, 10 out of 10 chapter. The second best chapter in Grand Blue is a classic one that I'd wager many would place as their favorite, and that is Chapter 25, Women's University Revisited, or Episode 6 of Season 2, also known as the chapter where this scene's from. Given how popular it is, chances are you already love this chapter, and don't need me to tell you why. But I like yapping, so this chapter is where Iori's tolerance and acceptance are on full display, to an explicit level. As not only he, but the Scum Bros as well, in an act of self-sacrifice, all stick up for Kohei. You see, this is a really pivotal scene for Iori and the Scum Bros in general, as not only did they feel like they were actually friends for once, but they all sacrificed something they sought after since their introductions. This swells with just a masterpiece of a panel when we get the payoff from the previous chapter where Iori spoke with Kaya, who coincidentally delivers the final lines of dialogue, closing out the chapter. Overall, if chapter 17 was the one that made me fall in love with Grand Blue, chapter 25 is the one that made me renew my vows, as this arguably is the chapter with the most heart in it, possibly even more than the number 1 pick. Speaking of, chapter 105, The Pinnacle of Flavor, is the best chapter in Grand Blue Dreaming, as it blindsides you by masquerading itself as a comedy chapter and ends with the best sequence in the whole manga. Basically, the chapter's main conflict is that Peekaboo want to party, but have no alcohol, leading to a club civil war. Really basic and unassuming plotline, right? That is until after it wraps up, when Inoue Kenji absolutely beats the living shit out of you with the power of peak writing, when Tokita and the rest of the senpais announce Iori as the new club president of Peekaboo. I'll let the panels speak for themselves. I've said it before, and my answer continues to age better than wine. When asked if I were stuck on an island with only one piece of media, what would it be? My answer is Grand Blue every single time, with absolutely zero regrets. This chapter's immaculate, man, and really just captures the true essence of Grand Blue. The absurd comedy, the tender heart, the beautiful diving, the insane drinking, and the celebration of youth. It's all in these black and white pages featuring a group of insane people who all happen to meet and become friends. Had this been the conclusion of the Grand Blue manga, it'd be bittersweet, yes, but I'd accept and embrace it, as the chapter just is Grand Blue incarnate. And the final 2-page spread is really special, which harkens back to the whole Yoshioka Kimitake facial expressions take I made earlier. Alright, that does it for me. Those were my top 10 chapters in Grand Blue. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments what your favorite chapter is, or if that's too hard, your top 10 pick. And I'll see you next week for the top 10 funniest chapters of Grand Blue Dreaming.